I welcome you all speakers and we begin our session today, Bihar, India and the world, connecting people, connecting cultures in changing times. Now we have been given this theme of comprehending cultural icons within the museum space. And I would like to begin by first congratulating the Honorable Chief Minister of Bihar, Shri Nitish Kumar ji, for his vision and path-breaking initiative in establishing a state-of-the-art museum which showcases art traditions from around the world. My congratulations also to Shri Anjani Kumar ji, Nodal Officer of Bihar Museum, and to Dr. Alka Pandey ji for their deep commitment as well as their innovative approach in planning and organizing this unique Biennale. I wish to express my sincere thanks to the organizers for their gracious invitation to participate in these celebrations. It is indeed a great honor. And to all those who have been working quietly and diligently in supervising and executing the various programs, Kritika, you are included in this, of this grand project, I convey my sincere appreciation and thanks. Today, the members of this panel will discuss Quatremère de Quincy's comment, "It is to kill art to make history of it." It is believed that since the impetus to produce art and artifacts is motivated by political, social, or religious concerns, if not for personal pleasure, can its impact be conjured up in a secular space such as a museum? And that leads us to a further question as to how do museums, which tend to regard a work of art chiefly as a marker of stylistic development in a particular historical period, strike a balance in projecting an artwork in its entirety. These are thought-provoking issues, and I have no doubt that all our panelists will engage with them in their presentations. As an art historian, I tend to view an artwork as a mirror of its time, a symbol of values and preoccupations of the people of the historical era that produced it. To begin with, I would ask, how do we define a cultural icon? For me, it is an object which is impressive, expressive, and provocative with an innate beauty which arouses an aesthetic experience. A culture icon in a museum setting can be very striking. A carefully orchestrated display highlights the elegance of its form and the mastery of its execution. This aesthetic experience is further enriched by its immediacy. I find a similar object in its original setting. And by the way, this panel is from the same temple as the one I showed you in the museum. Also creates an aesthetic experience which is equally exciting. Together, the icon, the monument, and its setting in natural surroundings provides a holistic experience that is enriching. For me, both the experiences, the panel in the museum or the one in the temple, are equally valid and valuable because they complement each other. For many art lovers, though, the aesthetic experiences, wherever it has occurred, is enhanced when an artifact is seen in the context of its ethos, the social, the cultural milieu of its times, which includes the type of patronage, the craftsmen, the available materials, and the technical tools and skills involved in its production. When viewed through such a prism, we begin to understand the multiple factors that shape the object, and that, in turn, nuances our aesthetic appreciation of it and weaves an aura around it. Today, there are many strategies and methodologies that are available to simulate the original atmosphere around the image and unravel its hidden facets. The museum can, thus, advantageously contextualize the historical and cultural background of the image. And when these various aspects are explained and emphasized, whether in a museum or at the site, the encounter with a cultural icon becomes meaningful and memorable. To discuss the theme that we have been given today, we have an eminent group of art historians, and it gives me great pleasure to introduce our panelists. Professor Sarit Kumar Chaudhuri, Dr. Leonhard Emmerling, Dr. Usha Balakrishnan, and Dr. Gauri Krishnan. We begin our deliberations today with our first panelist, Dr. Sarit Kumar Chaudhuri, who was appointed director of the prestigious Indira Gandhi Manav Sangrahalaya Bhopal in 2014. Prior to that, for nearly 20 years, as founder, professor, and head, he steered the activities of the Department of Anthropology at the Rajiv Gandhi University. He has been a postdoctoral fellow at the School of Asian and African Studies and has worked for 5 years on a collaborative project with the British Museum and other connected institutions. I invite Dr. Chaudhuri to share his views on the theme posed to this panel.
So good afternoon to all of you. Thanks to the moderator, Dr. Chaudhuri, and the distinguished panelists who are part of this session, Comprehending Cultural Icons with the Museum Space. Let me share some slides, but let me also add that I'm basically an anthropologist, but almost a little more than 5 years, I was part of a national museum, perhaps one of the finest ethnographic museum in our country and beyond. I remained associated, and that has given me some understanding in relation to how that museum, which is called Indira Gandhi Rashtriya Manav Sangrahalaya, popularly called National Museum of Mankind, that has perceived as a kind of a museum which has created a new museum movement in our country. In fact, this is based in Bhopal, in 200 acres of land, but almost more than 40 years of this journey, this huge 200 acres of physical landscape, perhaps we could have transformed into a cultural space. And the point which makes IGRMS very distinctive in relation to the contemporary museum movement in India, that relates to what the Chaudhuri's small note ends with. How do museums strike the careful balance in comprehending the entirety of cultural icons in the removed environment of museums? So what I'll prefer, I'll show you a few slides which relates to the different cultural icons. As I already talked about, that we are not here right now to debate on how do cultural icons need to be perceived. To my understanding, this should be left with the communities who perceived different, how they perceive most of these cultural icons may be perceived in relation to their, what we call the identity markers of the community. And this is a museum which has almost more than 28,000 of objects collected from different communities across the political boundaries of our different states and across the cultural boundaries of the different communities who constitute our nation. So this is a living museum, obviously, and the fundamental challenge which we have tried to confront in terms of the question of the representation, where we tried to involve communities as the co-curators, and that perhaps given us a kind of an strength to look at how the objects can be looked at in terms of its aesthetic, spiritual, and emotional context, even if it is decontextualized from the community in the larger sense. Now, this is the location of the museum. Those who have traveled to museum, I am sure some of you must have visited this. I can only say that I can only reflect on certain aspects of it, but in order to understand this huge museum, one should have a kind of an experiential understanding by visiting this museum itself. Now, the fundamental objectives or the motto of this museum remains to nurture and reflect on the cultural diversities of our nation state, and also to build up a kind of an, I'll say, the circular dialogue between past, present, and future, so that we can give a space to the alternative voices of the communities who have also, we believe, contributed substantially to our civilization and journey. Now, I'll just look at certain kinds of objects, certain kind of cultural space, just to have an idea. We have almost 12 cultural space which we have divided into. I have given the list you can show here. I'm not much talking about the indoor galleries, which we are having 12 galleries. Recently, another gallery is also added to that, which is based on India's Northeast, reflecting on the cultural vibration of India's Northeast. This is, you can see what we call the indigenous architecture or vernacular architecture, reflecting the different communities, different parts of the, who are locating different parts of the state. These are not kind of a replica. There is a serious process involved in terms of the selection of these different houses, involving the community, bringing them from the different locations, and then put it into the context where villagers, community members in large scale, they come and reside within the museum for months together and build up this space. And this is not the question of building up this space or this kind of an landmark, the vernacular or the indigenous architectural forms. This is community also remained involved by visiting these spaces every year, or almost alternative years, through which where they celebrate their festival, they try to have some kind of a maintenance of these houses, and in the process they remain emotionally attached to this kind of construction. This is a Wangchu house, which is fascinating. This was brought from a place within the Arunachal, bordering the Nagaland. I'll reflect on this little bit, little more later. I know the time frame. This is also part of this house, the objects and artifacts. This is very, very symbolic, and this is very, very important to understand what we try to reflect within the concept of the cultural icons. I'll come back to this, and little more I want to deal with this object. This is fascinating. Now, these are also, we are having what we call the Himalayan village, where from the Himalayan regions, different selective, again, architecture, houses are brought within this museum space. Many of these original houses, even you may find it difficult to locate in their original location, but this remains within the IGRMS. This is a kind of an Ladakh kitchen which we have built up. Community came and built up. Every year they come and maintain it. And during the time of Losar, people from Ladakh, they come and they have the all celebration of the Losar as well as maintenance of the that kitchen. I remember the former director of British Museum, Neil MacGregor, he came just for half an hour, and at that time this Losar festival was going on, and he spent ultimately for more than 2 hours with the people. This is a kind of an cane bridge. Apparently looks like very simple, but this has built up by the people from Arunachal, from very high altitude areas, people known as the Adi tribe. The mechanism is very fascinating. The technology, indigenous technology involved with this is fascinating in a sense. Those who have visited Arunachal have some ideas. There are huge rivers which people cross through this kind of, and it may be a half a kilometer of cane bridge. So the technology, the involvement of the material, I think that needs to be understood in that kind of an cultural context. And perhaps, I don't know how many thousands of photographs of this this became one of our most important installation for the museum visitors, so who never forget to travel and experience this kind of hanging bridge. Now, this is in relation to, we have a popular space, what we call the mythological trail. Now, we made some kind of an experiment here where we had two different kinds of myths. It may be the origin myth, different kinds of elements from the oral tradition, the so-called intangible cultural heritage. And then we involved the potters, different kinds of painters, sculptors to give a form of those intangible, the heritage into tangible form. And that has led to, I think, one of the most popular space, what we call the mythological trail. Now, this is the entry point of that mythological trail, where you can find a kind of a gate which is made by the Gond. Gond have the tradition of having this kind of motif in their earthen houses, but that taking motif from those earthen houses, which talks about different kinds of tales related to agriculture and many other of their livelihood practices. Through that kind of tales, they have experimented in transforming into a kind of a gate through which one has to enter into this mythological trail. Now, this is, if you look at that huge tower, this is very unusual. I mean, this is a kind of an tower of pots. Hundreds of pots are involved in making of this tower, part of a village tradition in Manipur. And we have built up a kind of an what we call the pottery trail, where we try to reflect on the diversity of pottery tradition of our country. We brought the potters into the museum space, and we have documented every aspects of their pottery making, the knowledge, the technology available with them. And as a result of that, we have built up another huge pottery trail. Now, if you visit to that, you can find out the kind of experiment which you have an idea about the diverse pottery tradition in an original context to a larger extent. Now, this is also very important. This is, I think, IGRMS is the only museum space, perhaps globally, where you can find this kind of experiment has made. Now, the idea of sacred groove, I don't want to take it further, but this is a kind of an concept which remained with many communities across our country, which has helped us in terms of preservation of our forest resources. There are a lot of writings available on this issue. This is the community called Khashi, which are the matrilineal tribe of Meghalaya. They have established their sacred groove tradition within the IGRMS compound, and every year, or at least in alternative year, they come, they perform the ritual, they come with different kinds of plants and seeds which they try to nurture within this space. And this followed by a fascinating what is called performing their Khashi traditional dances. So you can find out sometimes the delineation of boundaries between sacred and profane space becomes very, very difficult. This is the kind of a seedling they are trying to nurture in that sacred space. Similarly, this is also an example from Manipur, where the Moitis, we have established a sacred cult inside the museum, where every year they come and perform what they call the Lai Haroba festival, which is fascinating to see. I mean, some of you must have seen in your lifetime how this performance goes on for 4 or 5 days, even for a week. This is within the museum space itself, where people from the city of Bhopal hugely they join and participate in this festival. But we have different kinds of similar experiments of idea of sacred group from different other parts of our country, right? The Kerala, Tamil Nadu, Maharashtra, you can see even from the West Bengal, Jharkhand, the Santals and other communities. They are also having established their sacred space. And basic idea is to nurture, build up that awareness that how communities try to um, uh, uh, preserve their environment through this kind of an apparently sacred performances. Now, when it comes to the cultural icon, this is not a kind of an artifact representation, but food, I think, definitely constitute an important component of any community, their cultural markers. Now, every year, we try to organize such food festival, bringing communities from different parts of our country who come with their all ingredients and try to have a kind of an food festival, which has already created a huge impact in the museum. And remember, we are not Bhopal centric, though the museum is established in the Bhopal, but similar kind of practices we do in different regions of our country, involving the community, taking community from one region to another. That's the kind of and regular activities which we are involved. These are the, you can see the Bastar, I mean, this wooden craft in Bastar is known across the India, I think beyond that. So we have almost a regular basis, we do this kind of workshop within the museum space. Yeah, this is not only the sculpture, the different kinds of paintings also. I'll not take time, I'll just come to this. This is a very symbolic, what is called Kobilai, which actually relates to a very important mythological tale of the Meiteis of Manipur. This is a single wood object which around, I think, around 30 feet, made of single wooden object by one very well-known woodcarver from Manipur, who is no more. But this is an object which has traveled different parts of our country, including the France, and we have taken it to different parts of India, and that has in fact generated a huge response among the visitors. I'll just back to the one component and then try to reflect my perception, and then I'll be happy to interact in course of any kind of a discussion which takes place later on. Okay. Let me just concentrate on that maybe 1 or 2 minutes more, and then I'll end up. Now, this is an object called kham, perhaps one of the biggest musical instrument made out of wood. This is part of the very central instrument with the Wangchus. Let me just add that this is a tribe in the Arunachal who are having the chieftainship system. I'm not going to explain what the chieftainship system talks about in terms of the social structure, but it also reflects that there are certain kinds of inequalities and other things. But this is an instrument which you will find inside the dormitory of a village. I think the concept of dormitory is known to most of you who are part of this right now, the panel discussion. And this also remains within the chief's house. Now, this is a wooden, as I told, musical instrument or xylophones, which produce different kinds of, you will see the people are giving certain kinds of beating with certain kinds of wooden logs. Now, they produce varieties of sound, and every sound symbolically carry forward a certain kind of messages to the villagers, which you myself may not understand. For example, if there is a fire in the village, there is a specific kind of beating which will comes up. So somebody 10 kilometers away from the village can also understand that there is a fire accident in the village, and immediately people organize themselves to act so that this can be prevented. During the days of headhunting, I'm not going into the debate on whether headhunting is an appropriate word or not, especially suffixing hunting is whether conceptually right or not. But during those days, they had to be always very alert to survive the villagers from the enemy's attack. So the moment any kind of enemies enemies presence in village are noted, then people start different kinds of drumbeat, and how much people are actively organize themselves within a limited time frame, that will determine whether that village will survive or not, or the villagers will survive or not. During the time of agricultural season, when people give certain kinds of bits, then people, whole villagers will gather together and they'll go for agricultural activities, whether it is for harvesting or even for the showing. Now, unfortunately, these traditions are, if you visit to the Wangchu villages right now, you'll find hardly you find this kind of musical instruments, or they call log drum. Kham is the local term available in the village, because this has to do the larger issue of, I will not tell only the issue of Christianity, but many other factors are involved with the why the very notion of institution of dormitories fading fast from the community. But I'll just refer that after they constructed this drum from our museum, this log drum from our museum, which is a fascinating object, now that has created a kind of a sensation with the communities. And I was talking to just last week with one of my students, anthropology student, who remained instrumental to bring the people and having all this installation within the IGRMS. He told me this has inspired so much to the people, the kind of attention they have got in IGRMS, that after their return, there are another 4 log drums people have made in different villages. So how does the museum can play a role of revitalization of culture in certain context? I think this Kham by the Wangchus represent that possibilities of revitalization of culture, which are in many other cases fast fading out of the societies. I don't want to take others' time, but I must tell, I just reflect on certain objects, certain ideas which we have tried to nurture by bringing community at the center stage. And in the process, we try to, the question remains, trying to maintain a kind of an careful, the balancing act between the museum and the communities, so that the whole idea of aesthetic, the idea of the actual contextual essence of the objects or the cultural icons are not remain far removed in a different location within the museum space. I'll end up here, but I'll be happy to, in course of time.
Leonhard is a graduate of Heidelberg University. He received his doctorate degree in art history and has worked as a curator at several museums in Germany and also lectured widely in art institutions there. He's currently in the process of planning 2 projects for the next year, an exhibition on childhood and a conference on eporetic memories. I request Dr. Emmerling to posit his views on the subject of exhibiting artworks belonging to a different time and a different place in a museum. Mr. Emmerling.
Thank you very much. I will try to keep it short and cut down my text. I don't have a presentation. I only will read or present a text. So at the outset, I would like to thank Professor Pandey and the team for inviting me to this symposium at the occasion of the first Bihar Biennale. It's a great honor to be part of this conversation and to be able to present my views on the subject. I don't know whether it was mentioned before in the context of the symposium, but as everyone knows, or certainly knows, the museum as we know it today is a product of European Enlightenment, established to serve a variety of purposes, some of them pretty sinister, like many ethnographic museums in the West, or private collections that are only supposed to demonstrate the wealth and status of their owners, but most of them dedicated to a goal we probably would entirely subscribe to, like the education of the public and the preservation of cultural heritage. When the French revolutionaries took over the Louvre, the former royal collections, and turned it into the first state-run public museum to educate the new post-revolutionary citizenry, they opened a new and probably the most important chapter in the history of the institution. Not the glory, wealth, and taste of its owners, but the formation of an educated public became the goal of the museum. Simultaneously, in the context of enlightenment, new concepts of time emerged. Had Christianity been waiting for the end of time when the Redeemer would return again from heaven, enlightenment developed the concept of infinite progress, which means the idea of history. Humankind was on its way out of the darkness of its self-imposed immaturity towards the light of reason. As we all know, this didn't really turn out that well, and it came with terrible drawbacks. European civilizations were considered being much more advanced than others. The concept of primitivity, the concept of a childhood of humankind, all this came with this concept of a linear history towards progress, and it served to justify colonialisms, imperialism, exclusion, exploitation, enslavement, and many other forms of subjugation. Interestingly, this concept of history was, soon after its emergence, already the object of sharp criticism, together with the institution which embodies this notion of history, the museum. The famous quote you chose for this part of the conference comes, as we all know, from Quatremère de Quincy, published in his Considérations morales sur la destination des ouvrages de l'art, published in 1815. De Quincy was a politician, an armchair archaeologist, a writer and bureaucrat. Driven out of his country in 1798 for having been involved in a royalist coup, he found exile in Germany, where he read Kant and Lessing. After his return, he made an astonishing career, presiding, for instance, over the Académie des Beaux-Arts for 23 years. His main concern is, as we can see from the quote, the transformations of works of art into documents that would prove or support a certain concept of history. Instead of experiencing the aesthetic qualities of art, the beholder is left with a dull exercise to try to find evidence of a certain historical development, from Renaissance to Mannerism, from Mannerism to Baroque, from Baroque to Rococo, from Rococo to Classicism, and so on. The works are deprived of their inner life and their impact, since the motive of their creation can no longer be deduced. They are transformed into documents of a chronology by means of which one can write the history of art, but this happens by their reduction to mere material evidence of their time and at the cost of their spiritual content. And for this reason, they can no longer fulfill their purpose of cultivating a vibrant nation. Instead, the present nation is being founded on a nation now defunct. It is, as de Quincy wrote, witness to its own burial. And not only does the museum kill art in order to transform it into history, but it even transforms this same history into a gravestone. A few years after de Quincy, another, but this time a German proponent of enlightenment, was involved in the reorganization of a museum and published a text on the role of education and the part the museum can play in it. Wilhelm von Humboldt, the brother of the famous Alexander, statesman, reformer, bureaucrat, linguist, and philosopher. In 1829, 14 years after de Quincy, he wrote in his memoirs about the rehang of artworks in the Alte Galerie in Berlin and emphasized the preeminence of an immediate an emotional aesthetic experience over historical instruction. This again needs to be seen in the light of a much earlier text the young Humboldt had written more than 30 years before. It has a fascinating title, literally translated as Ideas for an Attempt to Delineate the Limits of the State, written in 1792. In this fragment, Humboldt makes stark statements which are relevant against the backdrop of the Quincy's critique. Museums are, in Humboldt's perspective, like libraries and universities, institutions of education or, in German, Bildung. They serve a certain purpose in the framework of the new or emerging republican state. This purpose is identical with the formation of the citoyen, the emancipated citizen. Humboldt writes, and I quote, "Whence I conclude that the freest development of human nature, directed as little as possible to ulterior civil relations, should always be regarded as paramount in importance with respect to the culture of man in society. He who has been thus freely developed should then attach himself to the state, and the state should test and compare itself, as it were, in him. It is only with such a contrast and conflict of relations that I could confidently anticipate a real improvement of the national constitution." End of quote. Whatever we may think today of ideas like a true human nature, what is interesting in this text, and it needs to be emphasized again, it was written in 1792, is how Humboldt defines the role of the state. The state has to provide opportunities and has to maintain institutions of education. Education is to some degree instruction, the provision of instrumental knowledge. But to a bigger and much more important degree, it consists in the formation of the emancipated and autonomous subject as the emancipated citizen. The confrontation with what may appear as a foreign and strange object, a painting, an artifact, not only requires the beholder to make an effort to understand what is in front of him or her, it also requires the beholder to reflect on his or her own processes of perception and the processing of information. The museum as an institution of education provides, on one hand, the opportunity of education and enlightenment. But on the other hand, and more importantly, it asks the beholder to try to understand what appears to be foreign, strange, and inaccessible at first glance, and try to understand himself and his own processes of understanding. In this way, Humboldt hopes the world and the self become transparent. The state, according to Humboldt, has to equip the individual with the tools and instruments to scrutinize the functioning of the state, to criticize the state, to enter a relationship of conflict and agonism with the state. Only then this freely developed individual will contribute in a meaningful way to the improvement of the state. The state needs to educate its people so they can become and remain free people. Just one paragraph, and then I finish. It is evident that out of the same source, the tradition of European enlightenment, two very different strands of thinking evolved. The one criticizing the museum of being separated from life, its impulses and drives, and lamenting its failure in building the nation. The other emphasizing the role of the museum as an institution of education for the forming of the emancipated subject and, as its final goal, for the improvement of the state. I want to finish here considering that we are much ahead of our time. And I thank you very much for inviting me to this wonderful panel and to this wonderful event. And I hand back to Dr. Doshi. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Emmerling. I'm very, very interested in the way in which you sort of showed the attitude towards museums and the contents of museums throughout the European history and how it was seen by the state and what was the role the state expected the museum to play. And mainly it was to educate, like, as you said, a museum is like a library of objects which people must understand. But this is quite a very interesting notion, and also the way in which the history developed in Europe would be most fascinating to see what they thought of a museum, how the changing concept, how the concept changed. And I think it requires a lot more study for people like us to understand. Thank you so much.
My pleasure. Thank you very much for having me.
I now invite Dr. Usha Balakrishnan to give her talk. She has specialized in the study of Indian jewelry and has published extensively on the subject. A recent publication, Treasures of Deccan, Jewels of the Nizam, features the fabulous objects belonging to the Nizams of Hyderabad, which she has assembled from various sources from around the world. The important curatorial projects include the setting up of the Jewelry Gallery in the National Museum, New Delhi, as also the CSMVS Museum, Mumbai. We look forward to seeing your gallery, Usha, as soon as it is completed. Internationally, she has curated collections of jewelry in the Kremlin Museum, Moscow, and the Fowler Museum, University of California, Los Angeles. She has planned and organized several conferences on jewelry. I request her to discuss her experiences of exhibiting jewelry in a museum.
Thank you, Saryu, for that introduction, Saryu Ben, and thank you, Alka, for inviting me to be a part of this Biennale, and the absolutely your amazing team. And I have been listening to some of the sessions earlier today, and completely engrossed and completely fascinated. So without much further ado, my presentation is very short, bearing in mind the 7 to 8 minutes that has been allotted to us. And I hope, we still have time for discussions and for some questions later. So as Saryu Ben has already introduced me, I trained as an art historian, but I have been working in the area of Indian jewelry now for almost 3 decades. I perhaps am the only Indian jewelry historian here in this country, at least. So let me start by asking this question. What do jewels mean to me? I think, jewelry, to me, I look at jewelry as art, as an art form. And why is that so? Because for me, it expresses, it communicates, it stimulates the senses, it affects the emotions, it evokes ideas. It is produced in culturally patterned ways and styles, and it has deep cultural meaning. So therefore, jewels are powerful artistic, cultural, and historic artifacts, saturated with layers of not only political history, but economics, with social and religious meanings, and with deep symbolic connotations. Jewels serve not only as markers of ethnic identity, but in the museum environment, in fact, they have come to represent, I think, very importantly, national identity. And as Dr. Chaudhuri earlier said in his presentation, jewels are identity markers of different communities. And all these layers of meanings, I don't want to waste time by going into the manifold layers of meanings that are embedded into each piece of jewelry, right from the material of which that piece of jewelry is manufactured to the role that jewelry plays in an individual's life. But I start with the question, where is India's National Gem and Jewelry Museum? Where are the jewelry galleries in our museum? After all, the history of adornment in India spans more than 5,000 years. India was the home of diamonds. India was the sole supplier of diamonds to the world for almost 2,000 years. Golconda gems were coveted, and even today, are most highly prized around the world. India, in fact, was the entrepot for the world's gem trade. And India has the greatest tradition of hand craftsmanship in the world. The CSMBS Museum, that Saryu mentioned earlier, in Mumbai, in fact, is today the sole museum in the entire country with a gallery dedicated to jewelry, which I curated and which opened last year in March, unfortunately had to close down because of lockdown. So how did I approach this? When the project came to me and we had a discussion with the museum, these were not royal jewels. They are not Mughal period jewels. And yet these are jewels that belong to communities around the country. So I have tried to create and present the manifold layers of meanings that is embedded in each and every piece of jewelry, as well as present it in the context of the 5,000-year history of India. All other collections are in storage. The fabulous jewels that were unearthed from Mohenjo-daro and Harappa and from Sirkap, Takshila, that were exhibited in the National Museum Jewelry Gallery titled Alamkara, which I also curated, has now been closed. And most importantly, the Nizam of Hyderabad's collection, the single largest collection of Royal Indian jewelry and the only one with a watertight provenance that makes an appearance only once in 12 years or so. The collection has never traveled inside the country, let alone outside the country, to showcase this beautiful collection to the world. Also, where are all the jewels unearthed in archaeological excavations? Where are our royal jewels? Where are all the museum collections? Where are all the jewels that today are in temple collections? I ask the question again and again, why are these hidden away, languishing in storerooms, in state treasuries or temple walls? While India's jewelry, ironically, India's jewelry heritage is exhibited as great cultural icons in museums around the world. Yet not a single exhibition has come to India and not a single exhibition has been organized here. Jewels are complex entities, and within the museum space, the storytelling can be quite challenging in my experience. Because divorced of their ethnographic context and isolated from their cultural milieu, jewels are exhibited just as beautiful objects. And in the museum setting, however, they can form a unique visual legacy. They are metaphoric expression of dynamic societies, of past histories, and design sensibilities. All this today is being reduced to catalog, to a 500-page catalog, and yet we don't see these connections within the museum space itself. I talk about theatrical displays, blockbuster exhibitions of Indian jewelry that travel around the world. Therefore, building a historic narrative through storytelling, I think, is very important. Balancing the aesthetic, the spiritual, and the emotional component. Connecting the dots, as it were, and ultimately presenting these jewels through aesthetic design. It's almost like a metaphorical tent with the narrative storytelling at the top, connecting the dots on one side at the bottom, and the design and the presentation on the other side of the bottom of the triangle. So I think that, in fact, is the best way to present these objects, these works of art, as cultural icons in the removed secular environment of museums. Now, I just want to share this. This is a 360-degree video of one of India's great Golconda diamonds. It is the Shah diamond, discovered in Golconda in the late 16th century. It weighs 88.7 carats. It's very close to the original rough. Historically extremely important. The 8 facets of the octahedron have been minimally polished. The diamond bears 3 inscriptions, Burhan Nizam Shah and the year, ruler of the Qajar Fateh Ali Shah Sultan and the year, and Jahangir, son of Jahangir Shah Jahan and the year. The gem was taken from India by Nadir Shah, the Persian invader, presented to Tsar Nicholas I of Russia in 1829. Today, the diamond is part of the Diamond Fund in the Kremlin Armory in Moscow. So I say, let the vaults be opened up. Let us bring out our jewels, put them on permanent exhibition. Let us open up our treasures. If not, as is the common argument, due to concerns of security, etc., if not through their physical presence, at least through the entire gamut of technology that is available to us today, whether it's virtual reality or augmented reality and the manifold other new technology tools. So with that, my appeal is let us bring our jewels out of the storerooms, let us put on exhibitions, because these indeed are cultural icons of manifold significance. Thank you.
Thank you, Usha. That was very interesting. And certainly we all agree with you that many of these wonderful pieces of jewelry should be exhibited in museums. I personally think that there are many pieces of jewelry which are special to a community. And that gives us an idea of what is important to that community. And to me, that is again a sort of understanding of the jewelry, of the culture of the people, and the way in which this jewelry was worn. I did an article in one of the Marg issues where we did Maratha jewelry, and I was told that the bangles have to be worn in a certain sequence.
Order, yes.
Yes, they were not to be worn as we would in an aesthetic arrangement. So these are important things as far as cultural elements are concerned. And I think if we can grasp them, we don't have to adopt them, but if we understand them, we understand the people, the setting, the ethnography, the cultural traditions, and that above all enriches our understanding. So thank
Absolutely.
you.
Thank you. Thank you.
And now I invite Dr. Gauri Krishnan, received a doctorate in art history from the prestigious Maharaja Sayadi Rao University, Baroda. She has been located in Singapore and has been closely connected in developing the Indian Heritage Center and the South Asian galleries in the Museum of South Asian Civilization, Singapore. She has many publications to her credit and is currently teaching museum studies and curatorship at the Nanyang Technological University, Singapore. In her presentation today, she will touch upon her own curatorial practices, which will probably give us an idea how she places an object in a museum. And she will be developing the content of 2 museums of South Asian heritage in Singapore, with special focus on the contribution of the Indian community in the development of Singapore. Gauri.
Thank you, Saryu, for that very kind introduction. And before I start presentation, I would like to thank Dr. Alka Pandey and Shri Anjani Kumar Singh for inviting me to be part of this prestigious panel. And I'm really enjoying all the 4 presentations, all the 3 presentations before me, and also the excellent moderation of Dr. Doshi, who's giving us a very insightful sort of anchor to converge our discussions as we end this presentation and go into the Q&A session. So without further ado, let me start sharing my screen. So I start by highlighting the point about musealization. That's the kind of a theoretical framework that I have started to speak about in the context of my presentation of the 2 museums that I have already been involved with from the early 1990s. And the last one that opened to public, which is the Indian Heritage Center. You are seeing the actual visual on the screen right now of the building, which was a purposeful project, purpose-built building for documenting the contribution of the Indian community to Singapore. So again, just like Usha, I'm also trained in art history, but much of my career I have spent in a museum, trying to document and also trying to evolve a methodology to showcase the South Asian history, culture, and art, and also the community's evolution through museum or musealization process. So in context of today's conference, I would like to pick up this point about how museums strike a careful balance in comprehending the entirety of the cultural icons which are removed from. So we definitely acknowledge that museums are man-made construct. They are a construct of the human beings, humankind, in trying to comprehend the entire physical world, which is both tangible and intangible, man-made and nature-made, to which Dr. Emmerling has just referenced. And I would also like to bring out the point about cultural relics or cultural markers that Professor Chaudhuri mentioned in the beginning, that Usha also alluded to. And so I just want to highlight, mostly everyone knows what is musealization, which I want to highlight a definition that has been put together by the Vice President of ICOM, Martin Schascher, which very clearly decomposes or debriefs the entire process into very significant markers such as things, ideas, and the musealization process. So you put objects together in a room, it becomes a storeroom, but you have to have a thought and an idea and a methodology, or what we call curation, in order to organize that material. And ever since the 16th, 17th century, when the Europeans began putting together museums, they used taxonomy, they used classificatory methodologies to organize the material. But in the 20th century, we have a slightly different approach. So all I want to highlight here is that nothing in a museum happens by chance. It is there because it has a role, it has a purpose. And when you remove an object from its context, where it has remained or has been manufactured and utilized or has been traded, or whatever has been done with the artifact in its original context, when you put it out, take it out and put it in a museum, it becomes, it gives itself a new, the museum itself gives it a new context, which is timeless and spaceless. And so there is this whole arrangement of diachrony, which then becomes eternally syncretic in a context of a museum, where you have objects all the way from, say, Indus Valley civilization to 21st century. So this puts the viewer, the audience, in a completely different space, and negotiating that is a difficult task. So coming back to my theoretical framework, which I think in the age of audience is really very important, because in a postmodern museum, and now in India itself, we have several museums that came up in the last 20-25 years that uses not the scientist laboratory approach, but uses the curator as the author approach, in which there is a meaning-making process that happens, where the curating of a collection or curating of a material is comparable to creating a text, and the audience is put together in the context of reading it. And so there are multiple meanings, and the juxtaposition of the artifacts also caters to, or lays very important emphasis on how it is going to be read. And in my curatorial process, I do not only look at the collection or the work of art or the artifact or a memorabilia, but to me, the documents, the photographs, the oral history, the lived experiences of the people around these artifacts is equally very important. So which is what I mean by contextualizing an artifact. So while aesthetic importance is significant, certainly significant and cannot be doubted. So, so when I talked about contextualizing in the early years of our curation process, Now we began to realize that we needed to understand the community whose culture we were trying to represent. And so we embarked on these enormous documentation trips. So these are images from our documentation trip to India, where we were trying to understand, okay, if you have a Nandi in your collection, what is the significance of Nandi, which you don't always get from books. Books will give you the iconography, but when you go and document the people, you realize there are so many rituals, so many festivals, there are so many ways people interact with the object Nandi in the temple's context. So this is how we have tried to bring the context into the gallery. So here is an example of the South Asia Gallery, which unfortunately doesn't exist anymore as the museum decided to change its direction. But in the original context, when we set up the South Asia Gallery of the Asian Civilizations Museum, we used not only the village gods, but we also used the classical material. And so for the village gods, you can see that the INR sculpture is the artifact, is the collection, whereas all these other village gods, these colorful terracotta pieces, are actually contextual pieces which were commissioned by a potter, through a potter, from the Madurai area, from where this object comes, in order to contextualize the importance of INR as a village god in the context of the Madurai area, from where many Indian
Gauri, I think you
community
have to share
members.
your screen again. We can't see your slides.
So, so this is what I was talking about, the context of the village gods. So when we come to the classical material, we could have just displayed the sculptures on a pedestal like any other conventional, museum in an archaeological, site, or even many of our standard national museums have similar approach. But what we did was to contextualize the temple wall, put the main Bhadra Koshta, the subsidiary Koshtas, and Deva Koshtas in which we placed the artifacts. Even the Shukanasa, the lion on the Shukanasa, we placed it high so that visitors can understand the context in which these objects would naturally appear. Then there is the living culture. So we also went down to Madurai to document some of the festivals, and we were there for 10-15 days. This is the wedding of goddess Meenakshi. And we had artifacts in our collection which we placed like this in the context of the gallery, but evoking the spirit or the essence of the festival, of how there are multitude of people who visit this festival and participate in it. And so we wanted to capture an essence of that through our displays. We also have similar rituals and practices in Singapore, which we have documented and also put it into our galleries through multimedia computers as well as several other displays. And we contextualize the entire South Indian culture or the Tamil culture in our South Asia gallery from the context walking from home to temple, and what would you encounter along the way in a typical South Indian village. So this is actually an interior of a Chettiar home in the context of South India. And then when you move out of it, you see a number of artifacts, and we have different stations at which the community members actually speak about the artifacts. So we have a nice piece of jewelry like the Gauri Shankar, and there's a Chettiar member of the community speaking about why Chettiars don this jewelry. So there's an element of authenticity also that has been added into the display. I will try to end here. I know I have almost finished 10 minutes, but I just wanted to show that how we experimented with our methodology when we were experimenting with our special exhibitions. And I go back to my first very large blockbuster exhibition held in 1994, also called Alamkara, from where I think the National Museum got the idea to title the jewelry exhibition. This was in partnership with National Museum Delhi. We had about 350 artifacts on display here, and we took up one theme and talked about adornment as the connecting theme across the 5,000 years of Indian art history that we tried to showcase. And we not only displayed artifacts, we also had contextual displays like this, where you had the Pichwai, and then you have the Jhula, in which the Sri Krishna's birth celebration, Janmashtami, would be organized. So we tried to also combine two-dimensional, three-dimensional artifact in the same space. And I would like to now quickly jump to my next slide, which is an exhibition which I curated with a large component of loan from Bihar and Indian Museum, Calcutta, called Nalanda, on the Nalanda Trail, Buddhism in India, China, and Southeast Asia, where we not only had the copper plate of Sri Vijaya period donated and excavated from the Nalanda monastery, we also had East Asia Summit session being held in the gallery to reinforce the idea of the ancient bilateral relations with contemporary and current bilateral relations between the two countries. So we also contextualize the display of Nalanda material with Nalanda monastery imagery. I think I will now just wrap up with one or two slides from the Indian Heritage Center project, which I have been involved with as the lead curator who was in charge of the entire content development, of course with a large team of curators, but it was a modern building in which we tried to evoke some elements in the architecture which had traditional elements, and so we managed to curate the design of the large temple door like entrance, as well as the arch Gopuram style carved door with architect and craftsmen from India. So it was something again where we tried to contextualize a very, very contemporary stylized building with elements from traditional architecture. And last slide is of the interior of some of our galleries, where we again recontextualize some of the material, and we use the augmented reality technology to give a layered information to our audience so that when they come in and they want to explore more, they have the option to do it. So here is a AR host who is actually talking about the significance of a Chettiar door frame, which is in the back. I think I will end here, and then if there are any questions, we'll be happy to take them. Thank you.
Interesting. But what I'm beginning to find is that most of us feel that contextualization is important. I certainly feel that, and so has Usha talked about it. So have you, and Mr. Chaudhuri has been talking about, setting up sort of examples which reproduce in some ways the original. Of course, Dr. Emmerling has given us a historical development of the museum, which is somewhat different from what we have seen. But eventually, what does a museum do? It educates. Whether it educates in creating, not reconstructing, but for you to understand how an object is, what were its meaning in the past, what is its meaning today, has it traveled along with different meanings, as Dr. Emmerling had suggested, that often the object has a meaning that is different to us today than when it was made. The significance is different. And I think we have now understood what is the importance of objects in a museum, how they should be shown, how they should be interpreted, and how we look at it. And yet I'm sure there are ever so many other ways of looking at objects in a museum setting or in a different setting. But the important thing is they should educate, they should enlighten, they should, above all, produce a great experience, whether it's aesthetic, whether it's cultural, whether it's spiritual. It's something that an object can, if it can conjure up that atmosphere, it has served its purpose, is what I feel. Thank you. Thank you all very much. And now we shall go to the questions. Yeah, I can take all three. What are the questions? Question number one. Question number one is addressed to Dr. Balakrishnan. How is your experience in context of facilities and labs of museums in India before deploying jewelry in exhibition halls?
I have worked with the National Museum and I have worked with the CSMBS. I think both these institutions are extremely well equipped. In fact, the CSMBS lab is a world-class. It's a world-class lab, and in fact, we had a very, very short window by the time in terms of installing the exhibition, as well as getting more than 300 to 400 pieces of jewelry ready for exhibition. And they rose to the occasion. And actually, interestingly, There is this beautiful object in the CSMVS collection, which is a hair ornament that was discovered in Elephanta during the excavation when the construction of the Port Trust foundations was going on. And this piece, when it came to me, it's set with white stones and with green stones. And the lab had the equipment. We decided we would test the stones. I thought they were green beryls, given that the time period to which I assigned the piece was 4th or 5th century, but they turned out to be emeralds, which reinforced the trade between Egypt and India, because the Cleopatra mines in Egypt were trading with India at that time. They were supplying emeralds to the world. So it was a great discovery, and that happened because the lab had the equipment, they had the wherewithal, they had the trained people who was able to make these conclusions. So it's been a great experience.
Thank you. Thank you, Usha. We go to the next question. My question is to me, Saryu Doshi. How can museums connect with children and young adults and market the museum as a cool place to visit? I have had this experience when I had brought my little grandchild to the museum. And when he came, I couldn't interest him in other things, but then I talked to him about the Jahangiri ruby that is inscribed, and I showed it to him, and I told him how its importance, what was the importance, how do we look at it, and even that didn't excite him. But what we did later was we thought of a story of it being smuggled out of the country, and then we made a story about it, how it was hidden and where it was taken. And he was totally engrossed, and certainly it was all fiction and certain mythology all combined together. But till today, he remembers that story. He remembers the Jahangir ruby. He remembers that it was inscribed. He remembers other things. And then as he grew older, he began to take greater interest in things. So I think it's not only just telling stories, but also making up stories around objects that may create interest in children. Well, I think we come to the end of our questions, and with that, to the end of our panel. I thank you all very much. I thank all of you for bringing a new facet to the understanding of how we should exhibit objects in a museum, or how we should talk about them, as I was saying, even making up stories around them. But the important thing is to arouse interest. And once the interest is aroused, then the person or the seeker looks at it differently and begins to understand and wants to know about it. So I think museums play a tremendous role in exciting our curiosity and teaching us how to experience things aesthetically and contextually, and maybe in an art historical manner understand what it was at one time and what it is today. Thank you all. Thank you very much.